Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll show you the process of modeling, lazy UV unwrapping and texturing this Spooky Handheld Detector in 3ds Max 2024, Rizom UV and Substance Painter. Let's get started. Before we start modeling, I'd like to say a couple of words about this model. I made it primarily as a concept. It has quite a lot of polygons for a static object that just lies somewhere, but at the same time there is a number of issues that should be fixed before it becomes a hero asset. First and foremost, objects like this should be modeled in proportions to your character, otherwise you risk, for example, the handle turning out too thin or short, or the trigger being too high, or the character's fingers intersecting the hose. I didn't do that because I simply wanted to model such a detector, without tying it to any specific project. Besides, I ignored the traditional pipeline associated with baking a high poly object onto a low poly one. This is probably not the best idea, since we are using a normal map and would like to get the maximum out of it. In another case, we would probably have to spend much more time on hand painting, so as to simply paint the details instead of forming them with a normal map. Anyway, I relied on the mid-poly pipeline, which saves us time and is especially good for conceptualizing, but leads to losses because it lacks sufficiently good optimization. We could probably do manual retopology and reduce the model's polygon count by about 30 to 40%. My pipeline won't suit AAA projects, but it can be used when creating your own indie games, where you don't want to pay too close attention to every model. As usual, I sped up the video 4 times. If you want to follow along, you can turn off the sound, turn on your favorite music, and rely on subtitles. In addition, I added a list of chapters in the video description and in the pinned comment. You can always view the model on Sketchfab. There's a link to it in the video's description. If you like the video, please be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. A couple of words about the model. I made it in 3ds Max 2024. I didn't use any plugins or scripts except for the loop regularizer. You can also use wrapper tools. I unwrapped the model in Rizom UV. In general, you can use any program, but I wouldn't recommend using 3ds Max, unless you are used to it and have several paid plugins. I like Rizom, although I've seen cases where Blender plugins packed UV maps better than its algorithm. Finally, I painted the model in Substance Painter. I didn't need to resort to any complex techniques or use non-standard materials, since basic smart materials and a couple of grunges were enough. The main style is set by the stylization tool. I divided the model into 5 parts: 2 glass lamps, the trigger, the switch on the sensor handle, and the sensor itself. In addition, I divided the model into 2 materials. One got a 1K UV map and transparency, the other a 2K resolution map with a padding of 16. Some UV chunks are overlapping on the second map. This is not quite an ideal approach. In particular, the upper detector screen is inspired by the sensor from Stalker. The circle segments should flash when someone or something approaches our character from the corresponding side. The correct solution would be to leave each sector as a separate element, so that we could give it the needed material in the engine, for example in Unreal Engine. In addition, we could write a script that would change the brightness of the emission map of the corresponding element. In other words, if we want to interact with the entire emission map as a whole, we can merge the glowing objects with the rest of the model. However, if we want to interact with each individual screen or light bulb, we should separate them and form them into separate objects. Of course, we want to put transparent objects on a separate material and not attach them to opaque objects. This is essentially relevant for game engines. Finally, it will be much easier for us to add a material with animation to the screen, for example something in the style of waves displayed on the oscilloscope screen, if the screen is separated from the rest of the model. The animation can be created in the engine as a separate material applied to parts of your model, or recorded in some program, for example in After Effects. As I already said, I made a kind of concept model and didn't separate the screens. Again, as you can see, I didn't apply the stylization tool to the screens, so I can always separate them from the model and then slightly enlarge them, so that they intersected. The total polygon count of the model is about 5.8k polygons, too much for a static prop that lies on a table, but not bad for a hero's equipment element or even a hero prop. If we wanted to turn it into a static prop, we should do manual retopology and reduce its polygon count by 2 to 3 times. Then it would be logical to group more overlapping UV chunks, as well as combine our prop with other props, forming a single texture atlas with a 4K resolution UV map. As I already said, I modeled this detector without references. I drew inspiration from Zelda, we are talking about the demonic face with horns, Stalker, and Ghostbusters. The idea is that a mechanical demon looks at something the character doesn't see, lights the way, and also shows the hidden on the screens. The lamps flicker and change brightness, the upper display shows the direction from which something is approaching us, and the lower one outputs the main information. I started the process by creating a cube and applying norms to it with 2 iterations. At this stage, it's important to reduce as much unnecessary geometry as possible. In general, we can delete half of the face, work with the other half, and then apply symmetry to it. We could also use manual retopology on that half of the face. In theory, it could have reduced the amount of sides of most holes. The model contains quite a lot of cylindrical elements. It's important for us to correctly calculate how many sides to give these elements. In general, many things could be baked, but I neglected the high to low polybaking workflow. The thinner the cylinder, the fewer sides it needs. For example, the spirals inside the lamps will be quite hard to see, especially since they glow. Accordingly, there is no point in giving them more than 5 sides. Many elements, on the contrary, get a number of sides equal to the number of sides of the existing holes to which they are attached. Often, 8 sides turn out to be the optimal solution, because they easily attach to existing vertices. It looks like this. We apply a single chamfer to a vertex, turn it into a polygon, then apply a single tessellate to it. Then we delete the contents and apply regularize or a similar function from Rapid Tools, turning the square into a circle with 8 sides. In some cases, we should play with the resulting vertices and move them in such a way that the resulting shape is more organic. I apply a single chamfer to most hard edges. In many cases this is optional. Often we can get better results by simply drawing chamfers instead of modeling them or baking them. I also spend a lot of time moving vertices. I do so while having the edge constraint function enabled. Rounded objects, for example buttons, get a couple of chamfers. Where sharpness is required, say on the fangs and horns of the demonic mask, we use 1 chamfer. The easiest way is to prepare holes in advance, and then simply connect the modules. I can fill holes with a cap function, apply inset and collapse modifiers to them, and later use their centers to place modules there using the select and place tool, while having the vertex snapping function enabled. Horns and fangs are made from cylinders using the taper and bend tools. In my opinion, it's worth breaking the symmetry of the face, at least slightly. In addition, we adjust the number of sides of the cylinders to the number of sides of the corresponding holes. Therefore, we should work on the mask, so that the holes in it don't have too many sides. This is a point I didn't take advantage of. For example, 12 to 14 sides would be enough for the eyes. For the mouth, probably 14, because the hose is a visually prominent element, and for the horns, about 8 to 10. Buttons and switches need 12 to 14 sides. In my case, the upper horns got 15 and 16 sides and 5 segments vertically, definitely too many. The eyes even got 22 sides, excessive. The lamp bases, 14. If it were 12, it would be better, though they have quite few polygons, so no big savings can be achieved here. The mouth got 14. Looking back, we could reduce this to 12. The hole for the side switch got 16 sides, excessive. The hole for the trigger in the handle, 12 sides, fine. The handle itself, 16 sides, Probably excessive, 12 would be enough for us. Indicators need more sides because they are quite large, however, since the model is cartoonish and stylized, we could use about 14 to 16. Here, again, we should think. For example, we should calculate in advance how many segments we want to divide the upper indicator into. I divided mine into 4 large and 4 small sectors, but such a configuration is not very convenient, for example for a motion detector, because it gives little specific information. For example, if someone's approaching us straight ahead, we will need to light up both front far sectors at once. If we want to give the indicator 9 sectors, each of which includes at least 3 polygons, we should think about forming a circle with a number of sides that is a multiple of 9. It's best to do this at a blockout or pre-planning stage. Another important question is the decision whether we will merge all other elements into a single object or leave some of them as intersecting elements. In general, both approaches can work. I prefer to separate from the main model only transparent elements and elements that I want to move with animation. Perhaps I'll tell you more about this in detail. In 3D modeling, the choice between assembling a model from intersecting objects and merging everything into a single mesh depends on the final purpose, topology requirements, performance needs, and how the model will be used, whether for rendering, animation, 3D printing, or games. Assembling from separate intersecting objects is the way to go when flexibility and efficiency matters most. A tree, for example, is almost always built from distinct parts, trunk, branches and leaves, each as its own object. This allows instancing, one leaf geometry duplicated hundreds of times, while stored only once in memory. The same applies to bolts, rivets, gears, or any repetitive detail. Separate objects are essential in animation. Robot fingers, joints, doors, or mechanical parts need to move independently, and merging them would break rigging. In architectural visualization, furniture, decor, and lighting fixtures are usually kept separate. It simplifies replacement, texturing, and scene management. This approach saves resources, preserves clean UVs, and gives full control over every component. Merging your whole model into a single object becomes necessary when watertight geometry or platform-specific optimization is required. This is mandatory for 3D printing. The model must be manifold, with no intersections or internal faces, or the print will fail. In game engines, especially on mobile, combining meshes reduces draw calls, which is critical under tight performance constraints. Low-poly characters, furniture with cutouts, like a window in the wall, or models for CNC milling often demand a unified mesh. Boolean operations, rigid deformation, and CAD experts all favor a single object. Intermediate workflows are also powerful. In Blender, use geometry nodes with instances and realize them only on expert. In Unreal, rely on H-load or merge actors. The working version stays modular, while the final one is optimized. A simple rule of thumb: if animation, instancing, editing, or performance is their priority, keep objects separate. If you need 3D printing, clean export or minimal draw calls, merge. A tree in a render is hundreds of instanced leaves. The same tree as a printed miniature is one solid mesh created via Boolean union and remeshing. The key is a non-destructive workflow. Keep the working model flexible and composed of parts, and generate the final task-optimized version only when needed. Again, if we were making a static probe and striving for maximum optimization, I would change the pipeline as follows. I would start with an ERMS box with the iteration count set to 1. Then most holes would automatically get 8 sides, and additional supporting edge loops could be added using the Insert Edge Loop tool while holding the Shift key. An alternative option is to start the same way I did, delete half the face and apply automatic retopology several times, so as to pick the iteration with the most pleasant number of sides for most holes. You can combine automatic retopology with manual edits. The main thing is to linger on this step longer and move vertices manually until we get shading that satisfies us. In general, the first step will determine the polygon count of our model. If we prepare holes with 8 sides and form a face with a high quality mesh, one where polygons are as close to square shape as possible, we win. On the contrary, if we prepare a high polygon face and inherit holes with 20 plus sides, we simply throw several thousand polygons down the drain. As for connecting cylinders to curved surfaces, usually my workflow looks like this. I form a blockout, then select the correct number of sides for the shape intersecting the surface, and finally, I separate the intersecting parts of the models from the rest of the mesh, and then apply ProBoolean to them. In cases where ProBoolean damages the surrounding geometry, I switch to regular Boolean. In most cases, such a maneuver requires additional subsequent editing. Triangulating polygons into trees is perfectly safe and even recommended on flat planar surfaces where they won't harm shading or participate in model deformation during animation. On completely flat areas, such as rigid parts like armor, weapons, walls or floors, converting quads to trees produces identical shading results with no artifacts, because the surface lies in a single plane and lighting remains uniform. Since these areas don't deform, the triangulation direction doesn't affect animation and won't cause cracks or inconsistencies. However, trees become problematic on curved or smooth subdivided surfaces, where differing diagonal directions can create visible seams in the normals, or on deformable regions like skin, clothing, or faces, where game engines interpolate vertices per triangle, and mismatched triangulation across adjacent faces leads to animation artifacts. In practice, we can always triangulate non-deforming flat geometry for optimization and GPU compatibility, but we shall preserve quads on organic, animated, or rounded areas to maintain clean deformation and smoothing. The key is ensuring consistent diagonal directions along shared edges to avoid any potential visual issues, even on flat planes. Speaking of cylinder connections, I try to surround each such connection with a ring of almost square polygons. In addition, I give each connection one chamfer. My upper indicator got 16 sides, while my lower indicator received 14 sides. At this point, I didn't even think of their final appearance. It came a bit later, and I replaced their inner parts. As I mentioned earlier, the hose ended up with 14 sides, though 10 or 12 would likely have been enough. This is worth considering based on the viewing angles. For instance, if the device is only ever seen from the hero's perspective with occasional glimpses in a mirror, we could drop it to as few as 8 sides. But if it's visible from all sides, we should make the smooth parts as smooth as possible. That's why I kept plenty of supporting edge loops, to maintain that smoothness. The hose itself starts as a spline. I add thickness and set the side count to match the existing holes. I snap one vertex to the center of the first hole using vertex snapping, then place another at the center of the second hole. After that, I add a couple more vertices and switch them to smooth mode. If we wanted the thickness to vary along its length, we could use lofting, but I'm happy with the uniform result here. Ideally, the hose polygons should be as close to square as possible for clean deformation in case of animation, like swaying or occasional bulging if something is passing through. As I said, the displays have 16 and 14 sides respectively. I built them from hemispheres, positioned them in the hole centers, and scaled them to connect all the points. I generated the display geometry by selecting sections and using create shape. Since the resulting cylinders shared the same radius, joining them with ProBoolean was straightforward. In hindsight, the upper display should have had 9 sectors with a side count divisible by 9. Because 16 isn't divisible by 3, I split it into 8 sectors, 4 inner and 4 outer. Here we can simply work on a quarter of the display and then use the symmetry tool to mirror it on 2 axes. I fixed some topology issues here by using the target weld tool. When shaping the sector borders and glass frames, make them thick enough. Stylized models don't handle tiny, intricate geometry well. Again, if this were a hero asset for a game where the character holds it and the displays are clearly visible, I'd separate the sectors from the main mesh and let them intersect the surrounding surfaces. That way, I could control each one individually in the engine, say changing their emission color or brightness. As for the display frame edges, they don't need more than 5 sides, so I can simply give some splines we create 10 sides. One more clarification. We can't use Probolene to connect surfaces with cylinders right away. First we need to break the cylinder, and only then apply Probolene, making the two planes actually intersect. Otherwise, we can simply use Bridge, connecting the inner edges of the frame to the outer edges of the hemisphere. When I create the quarter of the indicator, I flatten each of its sides on the corresponding axis. Next I ensure that it is centered exactly to its top right corner. Finally, I make sure that it is split into proper chords and if needed trees. We can select everything that has more than 4 vertices to check if something isn't right. We can also use the 3ds Max's X view tool here. I position the indicator in its place while having the vertex snapping function enabled. Next I simply attach it to the main model, bridge it to its surroundings, and then use the target weld tool to weld external vertices to their new positions. The second indicator is made the same way as the first one. It has 2 vertices less, and is much simpler. Basically, we only use a hemisphere and a frame. I'll speed up this part of the video, as nothing new actually happens here. Just as usual, it's important to not make the frame too thin, otherwise it will damage the overall look of our model. Stylized cartoony geometry requires some pretty thick, almost exaggerated elements. I create a supporting edge loop in the center of the hemisphere and move it around till the indicator is smooth. We don't want to have a pole in its middle, that's how we call a vertex that connects more than 5 edges. The lamp shades are made from spheres. They are mounted at a 45-degree angle to the device, the same angle we will apply to the antenna as well. Each shade got 14 sides. Perhaps we could have managed with 12 sides, since transparency prevents the viewer from examining these objects closely. In general, each shade got about 133 polygons and twice as many triangles. This is probably excessive. The inner part of the lamp is formed as a spiral. Essentially, I assembled it from 2 spirals, one straight and the other forming the final part of the lamp. The spiral got 5 sides. In theory, this is very hard to see, but I didn't want to lower this number even further, for example to 3 sides. Viewing the spiral is also hindered by the fact that it's made of glass and glows. In addition, it's partially hidden by the shade. Nevertheless, if we are looking at the device in the character's hand, our gaze will likely be constantly drawn to these lamps, especially if they flicker under certain circumstances. In retrospect, I would probably reduce the number of sides on the shades as well as the number of their supporting edge loops. To trim down this number, I convert my spirals into editable polys and then select every other edge using the ring selection tool. Then I delete every other edge and repeat this process several times. We don't even need our spiral to be too smooth. I make the lamps identical and symmetrical, including to group and reuse their UV chunks. 14 sides for their bases is a lot, however, these cylinders don't have supporting edge loops and don't multiply unnecessary geometry. The spiral is connected to the base using a separate module to which the band is applied. In this case, we don't need a large number of supporting edge loops, 3 is more than enough. The curved cylinder is attached to the spiral using the Select and Place tool with vertex snapping enabled. The bend angle can be picked by eye. In general, we could avoid attaching the spiral to the surface of the model and leave it as an object suspended in the center of the glass shell. However, this wouldn't lead to significant savings. After I connected the spiral to the base, I used the Select and Link tool to move the lamp base, attaching the shade to it. I placed the lamps in the right spots and adjusted their size, so that their sizes matched the existing holes in the model. We could rotate one of the lamps in local coordinates, so that they are positioned at different angles to the viewer. In addition, we could make one lamp slightly larger than the other. Any symmetry breaks are good for our purposes. Just like before, I create temporal centers for holes in the model and also for the base of the lamps, the way I can align them with the help of the Select and Place tool. Also, I have the vertex snapping function enabled. Next, I simply attach and bridge everything together. The antenna whiskers are placed at a 45-degree angle to the main cylinder. The antenna has 8 sides, a bit much, but on the other hand, it's convenient for attaching it to the top part of the model. Since the antenna is a visually prominent element located right in the middle of our model's top, its 8 sides are completely justified. Also, we can rotate it in its slot, the way that it's positioned at some angle to the device, which also breaks our symmetry just a little bit. Basically, this thing is inspired by the handheld sensor used by Ghostbusters. To decorate it even further, we could play around with the length of its whiskers. For example, we could have made one whisker much shorter than the other one. Just as usual, I connected it to the corresponding hole using the bridge modifier. Then I chamfered the intersection edge. The trigger button received 12 sides. I think it's okay, but we could have reduced it to 10 sides. Its outer edge got 2 chamfers. Also, I created a slight cavity in its top, making the viewer want to press it. It's always better to bake such details instead of modeling them, but it is what it is. The side switch was made literally the same way, except for the cavity which wasn't added. Both the trigger button and the side switch were positioned in their places using the Select and Place tool. I made them intersect corresponding surfaces ever so slightly. Obviously, I left each of them as separate objects. We don't want to attach them to the rest of the model, since we want to keep the ability to animate them at some point and move them nice and easy. The next part is universal, so I'll repeat most of the things I've mentioned in my previous videos. When it comes to final adjustments and checks, I save my model, reset its pivot point, scale, rotation and X-form, set the pivot point to the bottom of the central part, somewhere where the trigger is, and place it to 000 scene coordinates. I name each of my model parts properly, and also give them some kind of a unified first name to group them and distinguish them from the rest of the scene. Then I use a selection panel to scan my meshes for remaining angles. Technically, you can also remove poles and make sure there aren't many vertices that connect 6 or more edges. Next, I use the 3ds Max's XView tool to scan my model for some overlapping or isolated vertices and open edges. I had some isolated vertices, so I made 2 boxes, gave them proper names, attached each of them to corresponding buttons, and then deleted the boxes I've added. In most cases, this method fixes the bug. I've also cleared all the UV map data and prepared lamp shades for unwrapping. I unwrap my models in Rizom, but a couple of UV seams might get thrown onto the model in Max. Finally, I proceed to assign my smoothing groups. There's nothing special about it, but once you are done, you can also apply the weighted normals modifier to your model. Just make sure to set smoothing groups meticulously and mind that they will impact unwrapping. Normally, hard edges require corresponding UV splits for padding, but UV splits do not require hard edges. It's generally considered best practice to strategically pair and place hard edges and UV seams along natural breaks and shapes. The process is pretty repetitive, so I've cut most of this part of the video, nothing special about it. First I gave my model a unified smoothing group, and then applied different smoothing groups to most surfaces and chamfers. My model consists of 2 materials. One has transparency and is unwrapped to a single 1K Reso UV map, which is still pretty generous. The other one covers the rest of the model and is unwrapped to a 2K Reso UV map with a padding of 16. My model is relatively simple, so I've split my UVs according to existing hard edges and added some seams manually. Next I simply exploded all cylinders and straightened everything I could straighten in Rizom. Any wires or tubes shall be straightened to receive some kind of stripes texture. At some point we want to normalize our UV chucks and rescale some of them manually, considering their proportions in comparison to the proportions of neighboring elements. I perform manual scaling to allocate more texture space to visually prominent elements. Conversely, I reduce the size of UV chucks that will be obscured or less visible during typical use. At this stage, I use hotkey U to unwrap, O to optimize, C to cut, and W to weld. When adjusting UV island sizes, make sure to maintain relative proportions within the same object. It's generally good practice to keep UV size variations within 20% of neighboring elements. Always scale UV islands uniformly per element. Any uneven scaling will create visible seams that Substance Painter can't fix, no matter what tricks you try. After placing all UV seams, I simply relax elements and position them horizontally or vertically, depending on their locations. I mostly rely on Rizom's Optimize tool, or hotkey, and also its straightening algorithm. Since I want to use the stripes material on my hose, I straighten it. I don't straighten teeth and other tapered cones. Strategic UV seam placement is key. We can either position them along accessible edges for easy Substance Painter repairs with the clone stamp tool, or hide them in less visible areas. As an added solution, switching to triplanar projection in Substance Painter typically makes most seams disappear completely. For this model, I want to stack many small similar elements so their texture padding doesn't eat up the entire UV map. Plus we want to enlarge UV chucks for elements we prioritize for detailing. Remember, stacked UVs share everything painted on them. You may have noticed I placed most added seams on less visible sides of the model. During texturing, I switched the projection method for most materials and masks to triplanar. I didn't fine-tune the UV unwrap further, since it suits the simplified modeling process. I went for the laziest option, used the Alt-G combo to stack most repeating elements, but not key ones. Again, pre-planning is crucial. If we knew we would view the detector from above, we could stack UV chunks for its bottom elements. Conversely, if viewed from below, we would detail the underside and skimp a bit on the top. We can easily mix repeating and unique elements to throw viewers off balance. Finally, for extreme optimization, we could stack not just elements but say cylinder segments. I took a lazy approach here. Overall, you can experiment with textures at this stage and see how the model bakes in Substance Painter. By applying a smart material, you get a sense of how it will look during texturing, and can keep unique UV chunks for elements that shape its final appearance. When baking my model, I set the highest possible amount of raise on all tabs, disable the ID section, and switch my subsampling to 16. I've also made sure that there were no purple lines on my model or some red fragments. Also, I've selected the option to use my low poly model as a high poly one during baking. The ambient occlusion panel was set to same named meshes only. Just as my unwrapping, my texturing process went pretty lazy. We would get a maximum of this model if we actually hand painted it, but I mostly relied on some simple grunges. I settled on a 3-tone scheme of a red mask, dark grey frame, and a lighter grey plastic. You can use an existing palette, borrow colors from a reference, or rely on your own if you have one. I worked without a ref, starting from a rough color blockout, then tweaking hues while checking them from different angles and under varied lighting. I began with a plastic glossy stain smart material as a base. By the way, if you are worried about missing an element during texturing, apply a universal material without a mask, then paint over sections for other parts as needed. The model's key details come from the stylization tool. Everything else I do is just a prep for it. That's why the process might seem basic. There's no need to layer complex artistic grunges with another filter. I organized several folders with my base material, one for red elements, another for dark grey, next for light grey, and a couple more for different parts of the model. Whatever materials or masks you use, switch their projection to triplanar. It helps hide UV seams in some areas. For seams that won't budge, paint them out before adding details. Create a paint layer, set all blending options to pass through, and use the clone stamp tool to cover visible seams. You can tweak the cover layer's opacity and brush flow for better control. Always block out colors first and finalize them only after seeing a reference image, a pre-made palette, or your model as a whole. It's easier than matching colors one by one. I cut video parts where I picked colors. It took ages. For beginners, dark and muted colors are easier to handle than bright ones, which require careful selection. Most folders were set up as follows. I created a folder with a material that fills the corresponding layer. The folder received a black mask, and I used UV chunk fill to apply it to relevant elements. Overall, I duplicated the initial folder multiple times, applying it to the elements I wanted to texture. Glass elements received the Glass Wizard default material. I've also added a copy of it with a much higher roughness value as a dirt layer. Make sure to periodically switch environment and lighting settings to see how your model performs under different conditions. In other words, my work at this stage had two phases. First, turning the model into a color blockout, then tweaking colors until I liked the result. So I focus on masks, grunges, and fill layers, whose colors I can adjust anytime. I enabled an emission map for the main material and for the shades, as well as an opacity map for the shades. In addition, I switched the shader to PBR Metal Rough with alpha blending. I've been using the Studio 3 as my environment map most of the time. The hose and side switch decorative stripes were added as follows. First, the hose and the button received a base layer of rubber, then a slightly different rubber layer. The second layer went into a separate folder, hidden by a black mask. I added a fill layer and selected Fill Stripes. Initially, they were rotated at a 45-degree angle, so I changed it to 135 degrees. Then I added a height data fill layer and significantly increased its height value. When working with eyes, I gave them the Plastic Dusty Smart material and activated the emission channel for its base color. Before adding emission, make sure to give your glowing elements some basic texture, in case you want to turn the emission off at some point. I also activated the emission channels for corresponding dust and dirt layers to show the viewers some uneven lighting coming from them. Finally, I applied the stylization tool to some folders, activated the hand-painted preset, and increased the amount of brush strokes significantly. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day.